Hi there. Nice to see you. It's time for the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, journalists, anybody who puts something out in the Bronx so you can find out what they're thinking about when they write it and you read it and you say, oh, now I understand even better. And in our second segment today, we're going to bring in a Bronx author who has a brand new book that is really fascinating for people in the Bronx in particular. But right now, let's say good evening to Cullen Fagan, who is a reporter at the Mott Haven Herald. Nice to see you, Cullen.
Thank you. Nice to see you too.
Let's just start now. The people should know, if they don't know, the Mott Haven Herald and the Hunts Point Express are newspapers that are essentially written by students of the Craig Newmark Journalism School. So, a little bit of background about you. Where you're from? You're from here? You're from there? You're from anywhere? And then what got you into doing this?
Yeah. So I'm originally from Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I've lived in New York for the past 2.5 years. Um,
Should I ask if that means the Bronx or no?
no, so I've lived in I guess not, but I live in
Go ahead, it's fine.
yeah. But I lived in New Orleans for a couple years when I was an undergrad, and then I moved here, and then I ended up applying to the Newmark School after I'd lived here for a couple of years, and I was interested in doing local journalism. Yeah, so I got started at the Newmark School, where I met Joe Hirsch, who's the editor of the
Right.
Mott Haven Herald, who has created this incredible opportunity for the students to really immerse themselves in the Bronx, and we like go to class in the Bronx, and he helps us to really integrate our lives and our day to day in the Bronx, so that when we are writing these stories and that when we are trying to contribute to the Mott Haven Herald, we are doing it from a Bronx focused and not just
Sure.
as
Yeah, and
students.
somebody flying in from the outside. But what is fascinating to me about that whole thing, twofold. Number one, you get published, and so as opposed to doing it in school and handing in a paper and then they correct it and all that, you get to see what it looks like in print, et cetera. I mean, you couldn't have better training. The second thing that was very interesting to me in what you said, what made you just made the assumption I got into journalism. What inspires you to do that?
Well, for me personally, I did undergraduate journalism, kind of college newspaper, but really what most inspired me to get into journalism was I used to work for a public defender's office in New Orleans. I was an
Ah,
investigative intern. And I think seeing the way that those trials and that court coverage contributed to the injustices in the legal system, and thinking about how journalism had this major social impact that I think can often be undercut as just objective journalism. Being able to see really how that was impacting the lives of people who we were working for, it really made me interested in being able to tell this, being able to
Yeah,
elevate.
to tell the stories and help move the needle, so to speak. I mean, I totally understand that. And then the final question before we talk about a couple of things that you've written, um, what's it been like covering the Bronx? Because when you talk about, that we got immersed in the Bronx, it's undiscovered territory. And this is what I have learned for over many years. Every corner you turn around, there's a story there. I'm assuming you found the same thing, that it's just an unbelievable place, especially for a journalist.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that the with the history of kind of journalist coverage of the Bronx, because of this lack of investment in local news, we see so much parachute journalism, coverage of crime, stuff that really just doesn't sh- it just doesn't portray the Bronx for this incredible tapestry that it is.
Thank
And
you, thank you, thank you.
the
um,
Mott
and
Haven.
you just coined a term that I'm going to repeat at some point, and that is parachute journalism. That is fascinating to me and makes a lot of sense. Well, you wrote this piece about the Bronx has significantly less flood coverage. We have many shorelines, certainly in the South Bronx. We have shoreline in the West Bronx, shoreline in the East Bronx. We hear about flooding. All you got to do is turn on your news, even today, and you can see what's going on in California or Texas, and we've had our own bout with it. What is the deal with flood insurance for people in the Bronx?
Yeah, thank you. So essentially, what we're seeing is a massive increase in the risk of hazardous flood events. 2021, survey of the Bronx showed you're looking at like one or two hazardous flood events a year. They redid that in 2023. You're looking at up to six, which is the most
Wow.
in New York City borough. And that's coming from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. While this is
So
happening,
let's just be clear about that. So the
mm,
risk here is larger than maybe in some other places because of whatever the geography or,
yeah,
the
by that
weather or whatever.
yeah, there's a
Yeah,
bunch of different metrics, but this is looking at predicted hazardous flood events. And
right.
also, the Bronx has some so it has minimal infrastructure to help with flood mitigation, which like in areas that have invested more and have, wealthier communities that have invested more in things like flood walls, in marshlands, you're not seeing that as much. But the Bronx both has this higher risk of flood disaster, and it has less infrastructure in place to mitigate the effects of it. Next to that, we're also looking at the lowest rate in all 5 boroughs of flood insurance, which
Mhm.
is, you know, if we look at like how much flood insurance is allocated per person, it's hovering around $2,000 in most of the other boroughs, more in Manhattan and even more in Staten Island. At the Bronx,
$2,000 a year
per person
per person.
in flood insurance. In the Bronx, you're looking at between $400 and $600.
Wow, so it is more affordable.
Well, no, that's how much is, like, being allocated per person in the
I'm sorry. Okay. I misunderstood what you
no,
said.
absolutely.
What is fascinating to me, and you just gotta be a human on this planet, and you turn on the news and you see a town in Kansas wiped away because of a tornado, or you see a town in Texas, and right now in California you see floods or you see fires. I always wonder what happens to those people, especially what happens to them if they don't have insurance, right?
Yeah. No, and that's a great question. I talked to, some of the water damage restoration people, the ServPro people in the Bronx about what happens when people don't have insurance in these situations, and just so you know, the biggest like natural disaster, the most common natural disaster in the US right now is flooding. But the water damage restoration people, what they told me is that when people don't have insurance, sometimes they can work out insurance plans, but it like payment plans. But if they don't, they literally just don't get the damage like restored. And then you're looking at long-term health issues from mold. You're just looking at like these issues compound on each other.
It would never end, and you would never have somebody to talk
Mhm.
to do it. What has been, or has there been, a response to this? In other words, how do we move the needle, aside from you and Mott Haven Herald and everything else, for people to move it ahead? Are insurance companies making themselves available? Can they work with Bronx people, or we're not even there yet because the dialogue and the information still needs to get out?
No, I mean, I think there is stuff to be done at this level. Most flood
Uh-huh.
insurance comes from the National Flood Insurance Program. Flood insurance is heavily nationalized. You can get private insurance, but it's really uncommon, honestly, at this point. Which means that flood insurance is at least supposed to be pretty much like levelly, like it's supposed to be. There shouldn't be like so much competition rate wise. It should be pretty level because it is coming from this national
A
pool.
national center, yeah, yeah. Is there an estimate? Now, listen, we have 1.4 million people in the Bronx. Is there an estimate about how many people should do it? Like, who should really consider it? I mean, if you live at City Island at Hunts Point, or even in the East Bronx over in Cobb City, or over in High Bridge, which is on the west part of the Bronx. And like how can people determine what they ought to do, or how do we pinpoint who should be doing this?
Yeah, there's this great tool that was created by the Center for New York City Neighborhoods called Flood Help NYC. That if you put in your address, you can look at where you are on the FEMA floodplains and what your
Ah,
risk is.
so
But I would
they've created these flood maps too,
Mhm.
which I learned from your article, as a matter of
Yeah,
fact.
yeah, and what's great about those also is that you can look those they can also help connect you to insurance and tell you the next steps. But I would also like remind people who are thinking about it that 40% of flood insurance claims come from outside of these hazardous events. Even if you're not in a high risk flood area, you're still very much
Oh.
risk of flooding.
I hear it from the people on City Island all the time that just a big rainfall and it washes up into our areas. There was a co-writer on that story,
Yeah.
so I would love it if you would thank her for us for also contributing to the research on this and the writing of this really expansive and very important story. The only one who wrote it. And in other words, I follow all the media, and you have. So why don't we give a shout out over there?
Yeah, and so this story was co-written by Jana McPartland, who is
Right. She
a
was not available today. We have to be
yeah,
clear.
who is a peer of mine at Newmark and on the Mott Haven Herald.
Yep. And so now we only got about a minute. What you working on next? Tip us off. What's next? What's going on? What you got your eyes set on the next story at this moment?
I don't really
Oh, I put
have
it right on the spot there. I know. I'm so
um,
sorry.
something I'm working on right now is a piece on spiritual leaders in New York and kind of the next generation of spiritual leaders,
Wow.
looking at the young people who are in training right now to be like priests and rabbis and imams and how that's changed over the course of the
Wow.
last.
That is actually fascinating and cuts right to the core of who the people of the Bronx are with our diversity and, et cetera, et cetera. Listen, Cullen Fagan from the Mott Haven Herald, thank you so much for joining us. We need you. Stay here. Write about the Bronx. Investigate every darn thing that you can. And we'd love to have you back on the show the next time you write something we want to talk about.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, we will take a short break. When we come back, this is the book. The book is called Victim, and of course, it's shining right through there. And we'll talk to the author in a moment. Don't go away.